guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my second video in this series of 5 T1D tips. So in this series, each video, I'm just giving you 5 random tips that I think are important on the day, of things that I've learned through my diabetes journey, of things that help me to manage my blood sugars a bit better. Obviously I always say I'm not a medical professional, so you should always consult with your doctors and your nurses before making any changes based on things I've said, and all of this comes from my personal experience and things that I've read up on about diabetes. But I just think these videos can be quite helpful, especially if you're newly diagnosed, to kind of take information on slowly and in like little bite-sized chunks. So if you want to watch the first video in this series, I will link it up here or here, I can't remember which side, but I will link it in this video. But for now, let's jump right into this one with tip number 1, which is all about walking. So I'm actually today also filming a day in the life of a type 1 diabetic, which will be up on Sunday. But today I am having really stubbornly high blood sugars. They're not really high, they're just not wanting to come down, so I've been just above my target range a lot of the day, only by kind of 1 or 2, but it's still quite annoying. And one thing I'm going to do to help sort that out is go for a walk. So walking, I find, is so helpful for managing my diabetes. So anything kind of longer than 20 minutes ish of walking really helps me bring my sugar levels down, especially if they've been a bit stubbornly high. And for me, my insulin tends to act really slowly and it takes a long time to bring down any high blood sugars. So by going for a walk, I find it really helps bring those down and just keeps me a bit steadier throughout the day. The weather right now isn't looking very good, but as soon as it's looking a bit sunnier, I'm going to head out on my walk and hopefully it will help bring down the high blood sugars. But also, in terms of walking, one thing you need to be careful of is obviously it brings down high blood sugars, but it can also make you low. So if you know you're going to be going on a long walk, or you're going to be exploring a city and walking for a long time in a day, I would recommend lowering your bolus insulin before the walk. So whatever the last injection is going to be before your walk, I would reduce that insulin slightly, just because you don't want to go hypo when you have a walk. I find, especially when I'm kind of like going to London or whatever, I'm walking around, I forget how much it drops my sugar levels and I always end up going low. So when I'm out and about or planning a long country walk, I would always reduce my insulin slightly before. If you've just like spontaneously decided to go for a walk and you've already done your injection, just make sure to take lots of hypo snacks with you and keep checking just in case you are going low, because yeah, it does really affect your blood sugar, which can be really helpful when you need it to be, but also quite annoying if you hadn't planned for it. Speaking of changes to fast-acting insulin, another thing that is so important and which you might not be quite in tune with yet, especially if you're newly diagnosed, is pre-bolusing. So most fast-acting insulins will need to be injected 10 to 15 minutes before you start eating, just so they have time to kick in before the carbs hit your body. I know for me, I even sometimes need 20 minutes before eating, especially in the morning, because my system seems to be really slow to get going. But obviously you'll have to check with your own doctors and nurses and your specific insulin to see what the kind of instructions are for that. But I find this is something I've been really paying attention to in the last kind of 2 to 3 years, and it has made a massive difference in my overall blood sugar management, because I'm not having the spikes after a meal that I used to be having, because the insulin is now having time to kick in before I start eating. This is actually even more important if you're also high before a meal. You should always wait for your blood sugar to come back down into a kind of safer normal range before you start eating, because otherwise you're just going to keep going up and up and up. So injecting, even sometimes if I'm high, I'll even wait 30 minutes after injecting before I start eating. But again, you know, you don't want to be at the point where you're waiting so long that you're making yourself low, but it is really important, especially if you're checking your blood sugars after you've eaten and you're high. It might just be that you haven't left enough time since injecting before eating and your insulin hasn't had a chance to kick in yet. And so if you end up doing a correction dose, you'll probably end up going low, because then all of the insulin will start to kick in. So yeah, so just make sure you're pre-bolusing so you don't have any spikes and you're not tempted to correct a high when it's coming down on its own anyway, naturally. My third tip is all about eating out with diabetes and carb counting and managing your insulin around eating out. So I did actually do a video all about carb counting and my top tips for carb counting, and I explained how I do carb counting in restaurants and in kind of eating out settings in that video, which again I will link. But as well as those tips for carb counting, one thing I found that really helped is visualizing each individual part of the dish separately. So I used to kind of guesstimate how much carbs I thought would be in a dish overall, and I would always get it wrong because I always tended to overestimate because I didn't want to go high. But now I've started visualizing each individual element, and it's made me so much more accurate, because most of the individual elements of dishes are things you would have either cooked yourself before or eaten before, and you'll be familiar with their carb count. So for example, if you're having a burger at a restaurant, you can visualise the bun. Most of us have normally had a burger bun or a roll before, and you'll know the carbs for that. And then a portion of chips, you know, if you've cooked your oven chips or you've made your own chips at home, most of us have eaten chips before, so you'll know how many carbs will be in a portion of chips, and you can just add them together. And I find that doing it by each individual element is so much more accurate than just trying to visualise the whole dish. So then once I have visualised this and got myself a fairly rough but, you know, workable carb count, I then work out how much insulin I need based on those carbs, and then 15 to 20 minutes before I think the meal's going to arrive, I'll inject half of that. I only inject half because, again, you never know what the portion size is going to be until it's in front of you. When it arrives, I can see the dish and I can reevaluate my carb count, and then I can adjust and inject for whatever carbs are left that I haven't accounted for. This just means that you're not going to inject for what you think you're going to have, and then it arrives and you've got a lot less, and then you're going to go hypo. But if you don't inject before it arrives, then you're going to have a massive post-meal spike. Normally when we kind of go to a restaurant, we eat a bit more than normal as well, so it's really likely that you are going to spike, especially if you haven't had a pre-bolus. So this was kind of the best of both worlds. So my last two tips are about alcohol and nights out. So the first of these is about the actual night. Alcoholic drinks will have a tendency to increase your blood sugar because of the sugar content in the drink. So most drinks will have some kind of sugar in them if they're alcoholic, especially if you're having kind of wine or beer or a spirit with a non-sugar free mixer. These can really, really spike your blood sugar. You know, if you're having a VK at uni, they have like a lot of sugar in, like I can't remember exactly how much, but it's around like 30 grams of sugar or something crazy. So if you're having a couple of those, that is really going to spike your blood sugar. So I tend to normally have a bit of insulin before I go out, just to negate that sugar spike. But I also stick to sugar-free drinks as far as I can. So I will have normally vodka with a sugar-free mixer like Diet Coke or a vodka lime and soda. But even the lime cordial, even though it's a tiny amount, will tend to spike my blood sugar when I have it as like a vodka lime and soda. So I do make sure to have some short-acting insulin to cover that. But then on top of that, you have to remember that the actual alcohol in the drink will bring your blood sugar down a lot in the next few hours. So this tends to be overnight when we're asleep, which can obviously be very dangerous. So you need to make sure you're eating some form of carbs before you go to bed. I always, obviously, do a blood sugar check. Please do a blood sugar check. And then I will inject for the carbs that I'm eating because I don't want to go high, but I normally half my ratio compared to normal because the alcohol brings down your blood sugar so much. And because I don't, you know, have like a massive night out all the time, like especially when I'm not at uni, the occasional night out, it's better, in my opinion, to run a teeny, like slightly bit high overnight than risk having a really bad hypo, especially if you've been drinking. You're a lot less likely to wake up, and that's when you can get into some really dangerous situations. So stick to sugar-free drinks where you can, and keep checking your blood sugar. Have some insulin if you do start to spike, but make sure that you have your carbs and check your blood sugar before you go to bed. Also, make sure you've done your basal insulin. So normally I'll do this before I go on a night out because you don't want to risk forgetting. And I also, depending on how heavy I think the night is going to be, I might reduce my basal insulin slightly, just because, again, I really don't want to go low when I'm in kind of had a bit to drink and might be a bit less likely to wake up from a hypo or wake up later than I normally would and end up with a really bad hypo that day. I would also recommend making sure there are people that know where you're going and what time roughly they should expect to hear from you or see you the next day. They need to know that you're kind of safe, so, you know, give them a rough time, and if you're not awake and out of your room by then, I would just ask someone from your house to come and give you a knock to make sure that you're not, you know, passed out from a hypo, because it can be really, really dangerous when you're drinking, so please take as many precautions as you can. Final tip is for the morning after a big night out. So I find personally, depending on how much I've drunk the night before, sometimes if the alcohol is still in your system, it can still make me low up to lunchtime or even after lunchtime the next day. So I obviously monitor my blood sugars more closely than normal on those days, but also I tend to reduce my ratios a bit just because I don't want to be going low all the time, and if I've got alcohol on board, that's dropping my blood sugars anyway. So for my first, breakfast and lunch, I'll have a bit less insulin than I normally would, just because if you've had a really heavy night, it can really affect your sugars in the morning. One thing you can also do to kind of help work out what patterns you're going to be seeing in the morning is try and stick to the same kind of drinks every time you go out. So I will have either a spirit with a sugar-free mixer, so like a vodka and Diet Coke or a gin and tonic, slimline tonic, or rosé if I'm really fancying some wine. But they're kind of my main drinks, and I tend to not really drink anything else if I'm going to be having like a big night, just because I know now how they affect my blood sugars, and I know on the night and the next day what I can expect, and so I know already how I need to be adjusting my insulin and my food and all of that kind of thing to make sure I am safe and can enjoy myself. So yeah, so that is all of my tips for this video. I hope they were useful. Please let me know in the comments as ever any videos you'd like me to see or any tips you'd like me to cover in another one of these videos. I've got loads of tips to go through in this series, so keep an eye out for more of these. But for now, I hope you guys have a really great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!